Well, Dr. Widder, thank you so much for joining and making a contribution to the Hungry for Wisdom audience. Great to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you bet. I just want to read off a quick list of publications for folks, and I did a little intro, before we got on here and hit record. But you've got some books. The first two that I want to show people are the ones that precipitated this conversation. So, the Story of God Bible Commentary series. I actually hadn't seen this series before, and this book was
Good
assigned to
series.
me in a class I was taking, and I was like, "Wow, that's a really good series." So this is one that I would not hesitate to hand to anybody who wants a guide through the book of Daniel. And then you did in the Zondervan Exegetical series, you did this big honking Old Testament commentary on the book of Daniel. So my first question is, why would you write two commentaries on the book of Daniel?
The easiest answer is I was asked to. Yeah, I did not, it was not my first choice to be a Daniel scholar. Daniel was pretty near the bottom of the list of Old Testament books that I would have wanted to specialize in. And a lot of that has to do with what's in the second half of the book and my tr church tradition and what was done with all of those visions. And it's just overwhelming. And I thought, I don't want to try to sort that out. But long story short, I was asked to teach a class at a time when I needed something for my resume and I needed some cash. And the offered class was Daniel. So I said, all right, I'd love to.
Yeah.
And I got stuck there, and I've kind of been there ever since. So I was invited to write the commentaries. After I wrote the first one and they asked about the second, I said, "Are you sure? I just wrote one for you." And they said, "That's okay." So
Yeah, and it's
I
a
went
totally different
about writing
approach.
something twice as long without plagiarizing myself.
Right. I mean, so it really is a different approach. So for folks that
Yeah.
are more I guess you would say like the curious or the educated layperson or whatever. I mean, how would you describe the audience for this book?
Yeah, it's definitely someone who is interested enough to read a commentary, but I don't think it's a typical commentary. It's not super academic. It's intended to be written in a way that can be approachable and readable for people who read the Bible and are able to absorb enough information. There's a lot of historical information and all the things that commentaries have, but I think it really tries to position the book and the passages in the biblical story
Yeah.
and how we fit in that story too.
Well, and I think just personally, I think you did a really good job of picking the right rabbit trails in this book because there's a lot that you could pick from, right? But when you make these applications, you write those sections, it just seemed like, okay, that was a pertinent detail to spend another few pages on. And so I thought you made really wise decisions about, what to emphasize in terms of life application for Daniel. So thank you for that.
Yeah, great.
And
Yeah,
and then
you're
this
welcome.
one is for a deeper dive. A lot of you Grace and Truth members, you Bible nerds out there, this is a good one for you. So this will get some more into academics and discourse analysis and things like that. So yeah, I've enjoyed both of those. Okay, so you've got a few other books also. Every Road Goes Somewhere, which I think is that book that's sitting right behind you there, which
It
is
is.
a memoir about calling, living whole without a better half. So faithfulness in the single Christian life.
That was my first book, and I wrote it 24 years ago, when I was single, and in a lot of ways just expected that's the way it was going to be. I was just out of my 20s when most of my friends were married. So I wrote that 20 years ago, 24 years ago. And yeah, I still stand by it. I am married now for 8 years, so I'm a little bit of a late bloomer, I guess. Um, so yeah, that was my first book.
Good. And then a match
So
made
it
in
has a
heaven
special
singles.
place in my heart.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I mean, writing a book's a lot of work. I tried to write a book once. I was like, you know what I should do? I should write. And I'm like, yeah, this is not what I do. So I respect that. And then you got a match made in heaven, singles in the church, and the forest and the trees, teaching the Christian worldview.
That was my dad's project. So my dad was a lifelong educator, and he spent the last part of his career working somewhat volunteering in a Christian school where I attended as a student. And he really had a passion for communicating worldview through Christian school curriculum.
Okay.
But he wasn't really a publishable author. So he wrote all the content and then he handed it to me to rewrite and make publishable. So
All
that's
right,
that's my
tandem
dad's.
project. That's great. Yeah. Okay, so let's do some full disclosure here. I want to ask you about your church tradition or your theological background,
Mhm.
because one of the things that frustrates me to no end about commentaries is that sometimes, and you did not do this, sometimes authors will kind of hide any identifying verbiage. And I'm like, listen, if you're an amillennial, tell me you're an amillennial. If you're a dispensationalist, tell me you're a dispy. Like, just give me some handles, because then you got to like try and look for stuff between the lines. So where are you coming from as you approach the book of Daniel as far as a theological framework?
Yeah, so I'm a bit of not an anomaly entirely, but I grew up in a dispensational tradition. So that's been my history. I'm presently in a Reformed tradition. So you can sort
So
of
that'll
put
maybe
me,
lean a little
I can
more.
re yeah, so I have an understanding of the dispensational tradition. I don't hold to a lot of those ways of interpreting Daniel, especially. But I have not, I wouldn't say I've thrown out the whole tradition. It just isn't where I am right now. I'm in a Reformed church, Christian
Yeah.
Reformed church.
Is that what you were talking about when you said that the tradition you grew up in had like this overwhelming amount of information and you chucked it? Because I've seen those charts. I grew up in a
Yeah,
dispensational
yeah, and
tradition as
it
well.
wasn't that, yeah, it wasn't that my pastors specifically did that. I don't remember them necessarily even preaching the book of Daniel, but as a youth group, we would attend some youth rallies, area youth rallies, and I just remember the charts. I remember seeing the charts with the beasts on it, and so that was sort of where I grew up,
Yeah.
and it felt to me. The older I got and the more I, read about Daniel, I thought, well, they keep changing it. They keep changing who's who and what's what. And how am I supposed to understand any of that? I don't know how to pick who's the Antichrist, which
Yeah. Well, and let alone
so
what did
I
the
that
original audience
frustrated
understand?
me, and the more I studied Daniel, the more, at least from my perspective, that was a distraction from the book and what the heart of the book was really about. And so when I wrote my commentaries and when I talk about Daniel, I certainly think it has implications for the future, but I don't think its purpose for us is to help us chart the end times because people have been charting end times for a long time and it keeps changing. So who's got the final when do you decide this is the right one? But there are clearly things about the book of Daniel that have not changed. You don't need an end times chart for that.
Yeah, okay. So as much as I love Clarence Larkin, I agree with you, and we're gonna go ahead and move on from his his charts.
I have his book on my shelf just because it's so beautiful.
It is a masterpiece. It's a weird
It
masterpiece, but
is.
it
It
is.
is.
So what I want to do is basically give people some handles so that they can pick up the book of Daniel and enjoy it a little bit. And let me start by describing the for our audience, describing kind of the problem that people run into in just trying to tackle Daniel and say what am I supposed to be learning here? So the problem is it's just a weird book. There's not really anything to point to and say, oh, it's kind of like that, because you've got this narrative section in the first, 6 chapters, and then you've got apocalyptic literature, which we're not familiar with in our culture too much. And then you've got two different languages and it changes at weird places. And it's like this mishmash of stuff. So what would you
Mhm.
say is the unifying theme of Daniel that people should just know before they get in there? It all comes down to what?
God's kingdom endures forever. And if you want a little more than that, God is superior over any other system or God or king or throne or power. God is superior, and his kingdom is the only one that will endure forever. And that can sift out a lot of the clutter of Daniel, I think. The clutter that we've allowed to accumulate. I wouldn't say it's clutter in the book itself, but in our religious traditions, we've built up systems of how to interpret this, that, and the other. And honestly, sometimes it just clutters and we don't know how to read. We don't know how to understand a vision or take what it might have or a narrative because there's so many layers of interpretation on top of it. And so for me, it's God's kingdom will endure. It is everlasting and it will surpass and defeat all other human kingdoms.
So then why do it as what seems to be two books? Like why did Daniel
Well,
structure the
but
book and
there is not a nice little divide. So, the first half, the first 6 chapters are narrative. They're stories, these wonderful stories that a lot of people have heard growing up. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. It's got these great stories in the first six. So those narratives. The second 6 chapters are these visions. They're apocalyptic visions. Um, so narrative, apocalyptic. But then you also mentioned the two languages. But the language divide is not right along with those. So you can't just cut the book in half and say, well, here's one book and here's another book. That Aramaic language is chapters 2 through 7. So it just overlaps into the apocalyptic section. But its language is that of the narrative. So you can't pull the book apart. You really can't. And that Aramaic section, those 6 chapters, chapters 2 through 7, have this structure that holds it together. So if you work from the outside, chapters 2 and chapter 7, they are similar. They're both visions or dreams of 4 human kingdoms that are overtaken and surpassed by a fifth eternal kingdom, God's kingdom. And then you move into chapters 3 and 6, and you have 2 stories about faithful Jews who are persecuted for their faith in the God of Israel. And they face death because of it, and they're all rescued. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and then Daniel in the lion's den. And then you have chapters 4 and 5 at the heart of this structure, this parallel structure. And there are 2 chapters of proud human kings. So the first one is Nebuchadnezzar, who has this vision of a great tree, and God humbles him and he becomes beast-like, and then he confesses and he acknowledges who God is. And then you have his counterpart, really a foil, Belshazzar in chapter 5, who is also well, he's not really, he thinks he's a powerful king, uh, but God humbles him. And so you have this structure of parallel chapters, similar stories, and they're these captivating stories. And what I think part of the reason is why it's in Aramaic, nobody really knows. We'll start there. So everybody has a theory. I think part of it is that it's the language of exile, and their stories, apart from chapter 7, that are their narrative set in exile. And I think that those stories are showing, they're stories that it's a show and tell thing. They don't tell us who God is, they show us who God is. You get to see the superior God of Israel. He's superior over everything that these captives face. And when you have a picture of that sovereign, superior God, that's something that when you get to the second half of the book, those apocalyptic visions, you have to hang on to that picture because the apocalyptic visions are dark and heavy and foreboding, which is what apocalyptic literature in part is. And you can get lost in the discouragement and the defeat and the suffering that God's people face in those chapters. But you've come out of these stories that say, hey, your God is the God. You follow him and he will reward you, he will protect you, he will take care of you no matter what you face. Chapter 7 is the chapter in between. It's shares the language of those first chapters minus chapter 1, but it shares the genre of the second, and it holds them together. And chapter 7 is the highlight of the book. It's the heart of the book. It's an apocalyptic vision, so it's overwhelming and it's foreboding and it's frightening. It's supposed to be anyway. But then it has this throne room scene where one like a son of man receives the kingdom. And it's this glorious, amazing vision that casts hope for the future and really for the rest of the book of Daniel because you don't get that glorious view again. So I've talked a long time here answering this question, but
Perfect.
it's a big part of the book of Daniel. It's so different, but it really does hold together.
Yeah, so okay, I want to get you to give a description of or a definition of apocalyptic literature, but first I want to talk about the application of the stories because what you're saying I think is really important that the main point is, basically geopolitical sovereignty or sovereignty of God that even extends to the realm of geopolitics, right? He's sovereign even at that level, like over all nations and everything. And so we
Cosmically, even cosmically. Yeah,
cosmically.
cosmically, he's
Yeah.
sovereign.
And
Yeah,
then we tell these stories to our kids, and it winds up being, a bedtime thing like, and you should be courageous, like the three friends. Now, it seems to me, so, and please feel free to correct me on this. It seems to me that that's not a bad thing to tell your kids. Be courageous, like Daniel when he went into the lion's den. It's just, that's not where we want it to stop because that's not enough to carry him through life,
right,
right? Like, be courageous
right.
because look, God is sovereign, like that. So, is that how we apply it to our lives, or are there more layers that we're supposed to read as the casual reader?
Well, I think the first thing you want to do with a narrative, whenever you read the Bible, narrative or otherwise, remember that the Bible is God's self-revelation. God is revealing himself. And so the first question I want to ask is, how do I see God here? Who is God in this story? Who is God in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace? Well, who God is he's the God. Nebuchadnezzar has challenged them. Who can deliver you? Who's the God who can deliver you from my hand? Who's more powerful than I am? And Israel's God says, well,
Right.
I can.
Glad
Look,
you
I
asked.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And so who is God? What is God shown to be? Who does he reveal himself to be in the story? And then who are the people? And how are they relating to God? Who is the world around them? And how do all of these things relate? And so you say, you want to tell your kids, or do you not want to tell your kids, be brave like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. That's not a bad thing to do. I don't want to moralize and say that's all there is. First, who is God? But then how do I respond to that God? And so if I were to take the whole book of Daniel, and I have done this actually, and preach it in a series, my theme for the series, as I look at this book of Daniel, besides God's kingdom will endure, is take heart and stand firm. So you can take heart because of who God is. Who does this book show God to be? You can take heart. You can believe that God. And because of who that God is, you can stand firm. You can endure whatever hell, fiery furnace, whatever you face, you can do it. You can endure because of who your God is.
And that's a much different
So,
message than dig down deep, buddy. You've got the strength within you,
oh,
right?
yeah,
Much better.
absolutely. It's not because of who you are, it's because of who your God is.
Yeah. Okay. So apocalyptic literature. What is this?
It's hard for us. It's very hard for us because it's not something that's necessarily being written today. So I think first of all, you want to remember whose whose literature it is. Apocalyptic literature was the literature of oppressed people, people for whom the world was so bad and life was so hard that the only way out that they could see was God's intervention, cosmic intervention, wipe the slate clean, and start over. So remember whose literature it is, and that's important because in our culture, I think a lot of times we've kind of failed with apocalyptic literature because that hasn't been our world.
Hmm.
For the most part, we've lived pretty comfortably. But for people whose world is so awful and so bad that the only solution is cosmic intervention, this literature was written as encouragement. So start there. What was the purpose of it? To encourage. But if we have that, we can eliminate a lot of the traditions and things that we bring to the text. The purpose of it was to encourage. So ask yourself, what would be encouraging about this? Where's the encouragement? Don't miss that. The second thing I would say is don't press the details. Apocalyptic literature is very symbolic. You probably will need a commentary or something to help sort out some of the symbolism, but don't press those details, and commentators will do different things. But there's enough study in ancient Near Eastern literature for for a good commentator to say this is what this probably would have meant. And then remember that that symbolism was not there for people to parse out the details. A whole lot of it was to evoke emotion. So when we read Daniel's vision in chapter 7, where there's this tumultuous sea and there's four beasts rising out of it, we don't feel what Daniel would have felt because of what all that symbolism meant. Daniel's response was terror. He was undone. And we read and go, oh, we've got these crazy beasts and we've got, what do we do with all of that?
Yeah. Let's crack
But
the code.
its intent
Yeah.
was yeah, it was to evoke an emotion, first of all. And that emotion was terror at the horrible, the beastly nature of human kingdoms and kings. But then in light of that terror, who is God on his throne and what does he do with these kings? So there's all these emotions that we lose because we get so busy wanting to exegete and figure out what does it mean. Well, it does mean something, but it also feels something.
Hmm. I remember when I was
So
first looking at,
apocalyptic literature is hard. It is hard.
well, and it's supposed to be, right? Because you're supposed to chew on it. But like I was looking at Ezekiel 1 and just, kind of for the first time saying, what in the world am I looking at? You got wheels inside of wheels spinning different directions and beings covered in eyes. And I forget who it was, but no, actually who it was Dr. Kyle Essery out in Malaysia. He said, look, apocalyptic literature, the closest thing we have is The Wizard of Oz. And he said, when Dorothy opens the door and it's all just the colors. He says you're not looking at all the details. You're just supposed to let it hit you. That's where you start, right?
Hmm.
And I hear you kind of saying a
Yeah.
similar thing of like, okay, before you
Yeah.
get into the nuts and bolts, just take it in. Like however it hits you, that's how it's
Yeah.
supposed to hit you.
Yeah, that's
So
good.
so why would somebody choose to write an apocalyptic literature rather than something like, let's say, an epistle, where it's very logically like, hey, here's what I want you to know, just like this. Like, what's the advantage in the Jewish mind to, I want to encourage my people. I'm going to do it with something that maybe doesn't sort out all of the details for them. That's kind of counter-Western, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
well, yeah, right. Well, for starters, we're going to say Daniel saw the visions, so it is something he saw. And then when you get to the book of Revelation, which of course is apocalyptic literature, also, I know some New Testament scholars, and I am not a Revelation expert, so I don't want to say too much. It's kind of a code. It's written in a code that the audience would have recognized. They would have known who all of those symbols represented, but the actual things, people, kings, whatever behind the symbols wouldn't have known. So in a sense, it's a protection, right? They're not out there saying, well, Rome is going to do X, Y, and Z, and God's going to. It's a code. It's a protective code, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not an expert on apocalyptic literature, so I don't want to say too much of what might have been in the Jewish minds behind the apocalyptic literature that was generated. There was a lot more than just the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel to us is really unusual in the Bible because aside from Revelation, it's the only book like that. But there was a lot of apocalyptic literature written in Second Temple Judaism. So it's not so unusual in that context. It's just pretty unusual in our Bibles.
Okay, so then let me rabbit trail for a second. And if this is a completely worthless line of thought, then let me know. But the question does come up sometimes. You said Daniel actually saw these visions, and so then you've got this kind of like this sort of Western analytical critical scholar reflex that we have, which is to say, okay, if he actually saw the visions, how come so many visions? How come everybody who saw apocalyptic visions writes it the same way in the same genre? Wouldn't you expect some variation in the rules and things like that? Or is it not literally a vision, but he's just relating something in symbolic terms that are culturally known? Well, that's uncomfortable because we're sort of biblical literalists, right? Like we're kind of like I'm a
Yeah,
fundamentalist in that regard. Like, no, we want to believe exactly what it says. If he says he
right.
saw it, he saw it. So is this a literary form, or is he taking dictation from a vision, or is there a mixture?
I'm just gonna gut response say there's a mixture, but I can't really parse out for you on the fly what that mixture is because I honestly have not really thought that through very much.
Yeah, well,
It's a good question.
I appreciate that answer too, because that's a lot better than speculation that you get sometimes. But I mean, you just modeled for us exactly what you said, right? There are some details that you maybe just kind of let sit, like, and that's kind of
Yeah,
okay. So, yeah, all right.
yeah.
So then let's talk about some of the specific passages, right? So you got chapter 7, which you brought up, kind of the centerpiece of the book. I think verses 9 through 13 might be. Man, definitely probably my favorite Old Testament passage. That's probably top 5 in the book, man. I mean, just like especially since Jesus goes back to that so often and things. So anyway, so you've got
Well,
the
more than that, Jesus is condemned for his use of Daniel 7.
right. Explain that.
That's when the Jewish leaders say blasphemy. So it was more than just, drawing on this imagery, but they recognized it for what it was,
Yeah. Okay.
that he
So
was claiming to be God.
let me read the pertinent passage here. So Daniel 7, we'll do 9 to 13. So he says, I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him. Myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Okay, so we've got this pretty clear picture of God, and then it goes into these beasts that God judged because turns out evil can't stand in the presence of God and expect to survive. So that's good news. And then you get verse 13. I'm sorry, we'll go through verse 14. Um, 13, it says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. All right, so can you explain for us then the connection between that passage and what got Jesus in trouble?
Well,
That's all. Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, that was easy. Um, so you have God on the throne, and in the Old Testament, God is Yahweh, right? So Yahweh on the throne, and that's a portrayal that the Jews would have recognized. Ancient of Days, fiery throne, fire is often a sign of God's presence. And then you have this human-like figure who is in this chapter in contrast to the beast characters. So this human-like figure who comes and is given an eternal kingdom, and he's given dominion and power and all the things that belong to Yahweh, right? He's given all of those things, and he receives this eternal kingdom. And he also comes with the clouds. So there's this Old Testament, ancient Near Eastern thing there that a lot of us don't know, we miss because we don't know our ancient Near Eastern history. I'm not blaming anybody for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this Son of Man figure is coming on clouds, with clouds. He is a cloud rider. And in the ancient Near East, a cloud rider is a god. And in the Old Testament, the cloud rider is Yahweh, God. There's several Psalms that talk about God riding on the clouds and he storms on the clouds. So in this vision, you've got who's on the throne? Yahweh's on the throne. But then you have this second figure coming, riding the clouds. Who's the cloud rider? And he receives worship and eternal kingdom, all the things that belong to Yahweh, right? But we have two figures, different persons. I'm going to use Trinitarian language because that's going to keep me out of a ditch on either side, right? Two persons, but they seem to both be Yahweh. And so when Jesus says before the high priests, um, you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds, and he's quoting Daniel 7, they accused him of blasphemy because they recognized that figure as Yahweh, but a second person.
There was a
So
lot of
one of the
mystery.
things
Yeah.
I love about this, yeah, one of the things I love about this passage in the Old Testament is that there we talk a lot, or we hear a lot about Jewish monotheism. There's only one God, there's only one God, which of course we agree there's only one God. But this portrayal of Old Testament monotheism shows that there's room in that picture for a second person as that God. I don't want to say part of, because that violates Trinitarian language too.
Right,
So
right.
one God, but now we have two persons in it. So when Jesus comes and he claims to be that second person, they know, they hear, like he's claiming to be God. But the beauty of this is if there's room in Jewish Old Testament theology for two persons, then there could be room for three persons, right? And so there's a lot that happens in Jewish history and religious development from the time of the book of Daniel until we get to the New Testament. And I'm not an expert on all of that. So, but I can tell you that the book of Daniel's in the canon. So it's in the Bible. It was approved, not proved, but recognized by the Jewish community as God's word. And they knew what it said. So somewhere along the way, that message of Daniel 7 got lost. Or it's at least understood differently, interpreted differently, from how Jesus's audience understood it.
Yeah. Religious development is a really interesting thing because the documents don't change and yet people's understandings do, right? So you've got this book and then you
Right.
got, I don't know, what was it, 450 years later that Jesus shows up and yeah, it's like how can their beliefs change? But there it was and it got them in trouble. Yeah. Okay,
Which
so,
of course has not changed either, because here we are talking about the book of Daniel, and all of those visions have layers and layers and layers of interpretations. So to try to get back to just the text, we have to sift through a lot of interpretations, and they're not all right. They can't all be right.
right. Well, and even not speaking the same language, that's one layer of interpretation right there, right? We got to
Yeah.
deal with the translation of
Yeah.
the whole thing. So, yeah, so then you've got this little horn also in chapter 7, right? So you got Ancient of Days, I'll just say God the Father. You got the Son of Man, or one like a son of man. We know that ended up being Jesus. And then you've got all these beasts that come out, and there's kind of the one beast to rule them all, and that winds up being the little horn. So, I guess the most important question here is it Donald Trump or not? Don't take that bait. I'm
No.
messing with you.
The only name I ever put on the little horn or almost, well, it's the only name I put on any either of the little horns in the book of Daniel, because there are two, is Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, the second century BC Syrian king who launched horrific persecution against the Jews. So I will say, and I think that the little horn in chapter 7 and 8 visions is the same. Not everybody thinks that. So I think it's, and when I say that, I mean its first most immediate fulfillment is that historical figure of Antiochus the Fourth. I don't think it ends with him. I think the book of Daniel sets out a pattern that gets repeated through history. So it actually doesn't start with this little horn. It starts back in chapter 5 with Belshazzar. And side note, Daniel's visions of the little horn take place during the reign of Belshazzar. So there's a little clue there. We wouldn't care about that, except it ties to Belshazzar. So Belshazzar is the one who saw the handwriting on the wall, and God condemned him. And Belshazzar's offense was that he had taken these sacred vessels from the temple, God's temple, and he had blasphemed with them. He had worshiped other gods and he had profaned what was holy. So Belshazzar is the book's first example of a defiant human king who does more than thumb his nose, shake his fist. He defies God in a belligerent way. And the book portrays Belshazzar as just the first of a succession of kings who will be like him and worse. And so when we get to the little horn, one of the commentators I have used refers to Belshazzar as a pale foreshadowing of this little horn king. So the little horn is worse. He is arrogant, he speaks blasphemy, and we just get this through the book of Daniel, and it continues through history until we get to the last, the man of lawlessness, the New Testament calls him the Antichrist, the last and the worst of them. So there's something really interesting about kingship in the book of Daniel. Belshazzar is the prototype for the worst kings, and Nebuchadnezzar, somewhat ironically, I suppose, I think becomes the model of what a Gentile king ought to be. And they're contrasted with each other.
Yeah, one repented and one didn't, right? It's kind of the difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then if I hear you right, you're saying that a prophecy such as the little horn can have initial fulfillments and then, basically be fulfilled again because this pattern will repeat itself throughout human history. And so then,
Yeah, I
even
think
even
so.
after Antiochus Epiphanes, by the time you get to the New Testament, you still got fulfillments that are cited as
Mhm.
being in the future.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's true of every biblical prophecy. I'm not going to say that, but of these prophecies, we see that pattern, and Jesus himself, suggested that that prophecy hadn't been fulfilled yet, and that it was still coming, and that there might be more beyond that. So, I see it as a pattern of fulfillment until the last and worst of them all fulfillment.
So that's really every listener here. That's really important what she just said because that means that beyond a certain point, it is a waste of time to try and nail down exactly who this is referring to. I mean, obviously if there are real fulfillments, you want to try and connect those dots as much as possible. But if we focus on one and say now we got it, we've missed the eternal point that he is, or maybe just haven't gotten yet to the eternal point that Daniel is making about that. So multiple fulfillments
Yeah, and
is
I'm not sure I get the purpose of trying to identify the specifics of it. What good does it do? It doesn't change the message of the book. I don't know. Maybe I'm far enough removed from that sort of interpretation that I don't even think that way anymore.
Well, okay, so and I mean, I'm sure you still got, good friends in the dispensational camp. I do. I got relatives there that we all get along and have cups of coffee and, make fun of each other in very lighthearted fashion, right? But there I want to dig in a little bit in a very charitable way. I want you and me to dig into what that would be. So what's the point of figuring out every different fulfillment? Because we did spend a lot of time doing that in dispensational circles. So what is it that we were chasing? Or I guess if you're comfortable saying this, if not, tell me to shut up and I'll edit this out of the video. But what are you comfortable kind of describing like what you think the general hermeneutical error is in getting caught up in that?
I guess I think you're missing the point of the passage. There's very little biblical prophecy just in general is not given to us to be able to pinpoint what's going to happen. I'm actually just trying to finish up an introductory textbook to the prophets, so this is sort of fresh in my head, but the biblical prophets were their primary task was to speak, they were speaking God's word always, but they were speaking God's words to people about their sin and trying to call them back to faithfulness because they were so far from what they should have been as God's people. And so the prophets say, repent. This is what you're doing wrong. These are all the things you're violating the covenant. Repent, because if you don't, there's judgment coming. And there will be restoration on the other side of that judgment, but there's this judgment coming. And because they're speaking God's words, what they say comes true. And that's one of the tests of a true prophet. Do their words come to pass? But not everything the prophet said has come to pass yet. We've got this sticking out there in the future still. But their primary goal was to call people back to faithful living, not to provide people with a list of future events. One of the things that's condemned for false prophets is that they did try to find the future. They did try to divine the future and tell people what was going to happen specifically here and there. And that's condemned for true prophets. They don't do that. God does tell us a lot about the future to give us hope. In my view, he doesn't necessarily give us a lot of details.
Hmm. Well, and it seems
And
like
we like details.
he intentionally obscures the details a lot of times, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm sure part of that is so that we trust him with them. We can't control them and we don't always even recognize them. Um, but he's got the control over it. And you had mentioned somewhere along the way in the questions you sent me, what's the point of chapter 11? What do we get from chapter 11? This long detailed vision where you can put a history book side by side and plug in the names. What do we take away from that? I think part of what we take away from that is God controls the details. God controls the march of history and all the people marching in it. And it's not for me to worry about or try to figure out how all world leaders might fit into that. And that's not really my thing anyway. And I know for some people they have a lot more interest in those sorts of details, just generally speaking. So, I can see why you would want to try to think through the biblical story and what it says about the future to maybe see how those details have been fulfilled. That's not the way I'm wired, so I sort of run away from that.
Well, and we live in
But
a city with well, we live in a city with a nuclear power plant out here, and so I've got a lot of engineers and physicists and stuff. And so there's, when there's any kind of math to do, I got a lot of folks in my church that are like, "All right, let's do it." But when that's done responsibly, it's fascinating stuff, and it's a really good pastime and a hobby, and it's fruitful. But I'm saying this to say, exactly what you're saying. It's not that the details don't matter. It's just that we don't want to, miss the forest for the trees, basically. Okay, so side note, Daniel 11 was the hardest sermon I have ever prepared for in my life. I was looking at that text as I was preaching through
Yeah.
Daniel, and I'm like, how in the world do you get up and tell anybody anything helpful from this? It's like reading a newspaper 200 years or 2000 years after the fact. But but then when you
Yeah.
do see why God told us that, it's just I think the result of it ends up being worship. I mean, like you're saying, it just extols God's
Mhm.
sovereignty over everything. It's really incredible. I guess what I'm saying
Mhm.
to the audience is don't give up on Daniel 11, right? Get Wendy Widder's commentary and don't give up on Daniel 11.
Yeah. But make sure you see it in the context of chapter 10 and 12 too. So you don't just want to go study Daniel 11. It's in 10 through 12.
Yeah, it's
And
one kind
that
of
can help
visionary
you sort
unit,
out,
right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
So let me back up to chapter 9 then, because this is obviously the main sticking point of not just Daniel, but kind of all biblical prophecy in general. I don't know if it was the same in your the tradition that you grew up in, but I was sort of raised in that 1960s Dallas Theological Seminary dispensationalism, right? The kind of kernel theme side of things. And we were told that Daniel 9:20, is it 24 to 27 or 23 to 27? That is the rubric through which all other prophecy has to be interpreted, right? So you put it through that lens and then you can kind of understand it. And my question was always like, well, why is that one primary? Is that priority in the text, or is that just our favorite one, right? And so that seems to be kind of the big one to debate. And it's so bizarre. And let me just speak openly from my portion, from my part, it's so obscure. And you look at it, you're just like, I don't even know what to do with this. Now, obviously, the more you dig into it, the more fun you have with it. But and the more you see why it's there. But I guess where I want to start with this is you got the prophecy at the end of Daniel 9, and it comes right after this magnificent prayer of repentance. So what's the connection there? Why does this great revelation come after a huge sort of like national intercessory repentance?
Yeah, well, it gives it its context. And if you miss the prayer, you have no business reading the prophecy. The prophecy is an answer to the prayer. Just for your audience, so Daniel is reading and reflecting on Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70-year exile. And we know where those would be. You can find in the book of Jeremiah, there's two places where Jeremiah talks about 70 years of exile. And after 70 years, God says he will punish Nebuchadnezzar. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was dead, but, punish Babylon, and that would be the end. And then he would return his people to the land. Daniel 9 is set out as being in the first year of Darius. And Darius is a whole nother issue, but at the very least, we're in around the first year of Cyrus, the Persian, who is the one who destroyed Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. So, but that hasn't happened yet because Daniel's still praying for exile to end, right? But we're right on the cusp of it historically. Daniel has to know that Babylon's been destroyed, right? Because Darius is now the king. Babylon's been destroyed. He's reading Jeremiah's prophecy. And Jeremiah also says in this prophecy of exile coming to an end that the people need to repent. They need to confess. Here's Daniel sitting in exile, and Babylon's been destroyed. He confesses. He does what apparently has not been done yet, perhaps. He's confessing nationally for the people on behalf of them the sin that led to exile in the first place. And his prayer is for forgiveness and his prayer is for restoration. And then Gabriel shows up and Gabriel says, I'm here in response to your prayer. And you say, well, how on earth is Gabriel's revelation here a response to Daniel's prayer? Daniel was praying for the end of exile. Here's Gabriel with a revelation that has confused people for a very long time. But what Gabriel says is, okay, yeah, your 70-year exile, it's going to end, but really, exile is going to be a lot longer than that. There is a greater exile than what you're praying for to end. So your 70-year exile, Daniel, is about to end, but really there's 490 more years to go. Now, I am not in the camp that's going to count all those years because there's a whole lot of symbolism. This is part of apocalyptic. It's known symbolism in the Bible, the 70 and the sevens and the seven times seven. It's all there.
Right.
It's all very symbolic. So Gabriel says, yeah, great, Daniel, your exile's about to end, sort of, but there's a much longer exile to come. But take heart in all the symbolism of this revelation. The restoration is far beyond anything Daniel was praying for. And the only place that kind of restoration and that sort of hope comes is in the person of Jesus. People often get to Jesus here in the 70 weeks, the 70 weeks of Daniel, through this anointed one. There's two anointed ones in the prophecy, and I'm maybe saying more than your listener knows
Go
at the
ahead.
point, or maybe they all know this. I don't know. And I do think Jesus is in the prophecy. I don't think he's actually one of the anointed ones, but that's a really detailed argument that you'll have to read in the commentary. I think the whole prophecy is pointing to Jesus as the one who's going to bring about the final restoration from the greatest exile. He is the hope for that. In all the symbolism of the prophecy, that's all tied up in the year of Jubilee, which is, takes us all the way back to Leviticus when there was this bondage. And after 49 years, the 50th year, you set them all free. 49 is 7 times 7, and it all fits into this 490 business. And it's really hard to preach, but it's such an amazing picture of Daniel responding to his situation and what he understands in the Bible. He sees his cultural situation. Babylon is destroyed, but exile hasn't ended. And he's reading that exile is supposed to end when Babylon's destroyed. And he responds. He confesses, he prays, and it is just a fantastic confessional prayer, penitential prayer. It's beautiful. And the response to that from God is, yep, your exile is going to end soon, but there's much more to come in terms of exile, but also restoration.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like geopolitical information buried in there too. There's covenants that get broken halfway through, and there's, all of this stuff. And it's like, man, he really made the most of that little bit of paper and ink that he had because he crammed a lot into that.
And you're right that a lot of it's obscure and it's hard. This would be Hebrew. It's hard Hebrew. This that's why there's so much scholarship that's out there on these 4 verses. An old Old Testament commentator, James Montgomery, called the scholarship on the 70 weeks the dismal swamp of Old Testament scholarship. And it really is.
Yeah.
You can lose really easily the message of hope, but the hope comes after a lot of hardship,
Yeah, and the
at
necessity for
least for Daniel's
repentance.
immediate audience.
Right, like what you're saying with all the
Yes.
prophets in general, it's, their message is pretty much like, hey, repent. Like Messiah's coming, hang in there, but the way you hang in there is you repent. And like the
Yeah.
modern prophecy conferences are just hilarious to me. I mean, in a tragic and infuriating flip over tables and whip people kind of way, but with that caveat, they're hilarious because everything is good news. Everything is you're going to conquer in 2025 and God's going to heal you and
Mm.
give you this and whatever. It's like there is no biblical corollary or precedent for any of these messages of what we're calling prophecy. And it's just like if we actually had a prophet now, I think we'd probably string him up on a cross and kill him,
Yeah.
because they were
Yeah.
they were not always the nicest people or the most normal people actually. I wonder
No,
about that though.
and their messages were not received. The messages that the people wanted to hear were from the false prophets
Not
who
much has
told them what
changed.
they wanted to hear. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you get chapter 9 and then you've got the prayer. I'm recapping a little bit. You've got the prayer and then the answer to the prayer is this prophecy of deliverance but with warnings that it's not going to be clean. And then you get into 10 through 12 and that's kind of its own vision. It kind of has the same point as other parts of the part of the book of Daniel, but it also adds new things to the lump. So if average Joe or Josephine or whatever is picking up the book of Daniel and going to read chapter 10 through 12, what are they about to interact with? What are they supposed to get from it?
Well, in part, they're looking at an expansion of the visions in 7 and 8. So those visions showed you the kingdoms, and when you get to, so 7 is the cosmic scope. You have 4 world kingdoms and then the fifth eternal. 8 narrows it to just 2 of the kingdoms. By the time we get to 11, 10 and 11, it's really focusing on just that one outgrowth of the Greek kingdom, this Antiochus the Fourth, persecution that came out of that, and then his defeat and ultimately resurrection, which is great. So, but chapter 11 is expanding on a lot of what you see, or part of what you see in the visions of 7 and 8. Chapter 10 sets it up with kind of its own sort of unusual passage where Daniel has a vision and this man like figure, human like figure appears and tells him he's there to deliver the message. And then chapter 11 is the message that he's there to deliver. And chapter 12 finishes the message. And then Daniel has one little final vision, and then the book is done. Chapter 12 does cast the hope for resurrection. It's the only place in the Old Testament where resurrection is clear, that there will be a resurrection and reward for the righteous. So if you can make it to chapter 12, you've got the great hope of resurrection. But yeah, getting there is a little dicey, getting to
Sure,
chapter
sure.
12.
Is it chapter 10 where the angel says, "Hey, I'm sorry, I got held up by the Prince of Persia. He was fighting me. Is
Yes,
that
it is. Yes, it
okay?
is.
So I heard a great take on that once, and by great I mean not, but that is like okay, we went on a map and we saw the distance between Susa and in Persia and where Daniel would have been in this other place, and they could calculate how fast an angel could fly and things like that. And like somebody was telling me about it, and they were like, yeah, I heard this somewhere, and I'm like, did they ever tell you the point of the book of Daniel, or did they just kind of stall out there? You know, but you get like, oh, okay, we've got an introduction to angelology and all of this stuff, but
Yeah.
there's more distractions, right? I don't know. I love me some
Yep.
angelology. It's good stuff. I'm just saying, let's not just set the parking brake in angelology. Okay, so one thing that I really appreciated about your commentaries is that the disagreements that you had, which I mean, every commentator takes on other commentators and critiques their positions. That's a good thing to do, right? There's nothing, just for the general audience, there's nothing rude about one author disagreeing with another one. Sometimes the disagreements are, a little more personal in nature. And I just want to say thank you for critiquing, and as classy as you did it, especially for critiquing the Daniel diet plan from Rick Warren. When he came out with that book, I was like, this guy figured out how to turn a buck on biblical prophecy. You got to be kidding me. Now, you don't have to agree with anything I'm saying if you don't want. I was happy to see a very well measured and well researched and well articulated scholarly takedown of that craziness. So I appreciate that contribution to general theology for what it's worth. Let me ask you this question. Last question here, I think. What's your most controversial take, or like maybe among your peers or something, the one that you would get most pushback for as far as an interpretive take that you've got on a part of Daniel?
I wouldn't necessarily get a lot pushback from other scholars, although many would. My view of the four kingdoms is that the fourth kingdom, at least in my circles and possibly your background, the understanding of the fourth kingdom in Daniel's visions is that it is referring to Rome. I understand it to refer to Greece for a whole lot of reasons that I detail in the book, and I'm not alone in this view, just not standing on my own little hill here. Um, at least in my tradition, the fourth kingdom is Rome, and I think it's Greece.
Okay. And so
But
is
I
that
don't, and I think part of the pushback against that as well. But it continues to the time of Jesus, and it has ongoing relevance. So it has to be Rome. Like, well, there's this pattern of repeating prophecy and prediction that keeps going, and I don't think taking the Greek view of the fourth kingdom eliminates that. So
okay? So let me throw a detail in here and then have you kick it around, handle this how you would. So, because that's been my understanding as well, is that the fourth kingdom would have been Rome. So if you take chapter 2 and you get the statue, then the rock that's cut out without human hands that comes in and destroys it. I understand that to be Christ, reference to the virgin birth, whether Daniel knew it or not. That seems to be, kind of a good place to peg that fulfillment. And so the rock, not made with human hands, comes in and crushes the feet of the kingdom. He was born into the Roman Empire. That timeline seems to line up to me. So then what is with the Greek
yeah.
view, what do you do with that then?
Yeah, so any view of the kingdoms, and the Greek and the Roman view are the primary two. So, but there are others, but any view of the king who the kingdoms are has gaps that you have to account for, or just say there are gaps. So if Rome is the fourth kingdom, there still are gaps in the chronologies to account for. The fourth beast is said to be different from all the rest. And this is in the vision of seven, Daniel 7. The vision makes a big deal about this beast being different. And so in the Greek view, you say, well, the Roman Empire was really not that different from the Greek. You still
Mm.
have Hellenism and this whole, it's like a continuation of, but the Greek was quite different because it was a Western movement into the other Eastern kingdoms. So that's one way of coming at it. I don't think that the fourth kingdom being Rome, because it has to fit with the timing of Jesus, I think you can get around that and still have Jesus.
Yeah.
Like I still have Jesus.
Right. Right.
But I still think the fourth kingdom is Greece.
Sure, sure.
And
Okay.
I think that in for the most part, I think that for contextual reasons in the book, that the book has this little horn, and in chapter 8, The angel tells us who they are, pretty much, and nobody argues about the identity of the little horn in chapter 8. Any dispensational scholar will say the little horn in chapter 8 is Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. But then they will go back to chapter 7 and say it's a different little horn in chapter 7. And in my reading, it just the way the book is put together, it just makes the best sense for the little horn to be the same. So that's the simplest explanation I can
Mhm.
give. And I just will say everybody has gaps, and you have to do some hand waving to try to sort out, persuade people which view is better.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. Thank you for your contribution to the conversation. There is so much nonsense to wade through when you're dealing with prophecy and trying to just grow your own understanding of the text and all that. So I really do appreciate, what you've put out there. And I've actually already recommended the Story of God Bible commentary to a couple of people, and then the exegetical commentary just today. Somebody, she was in here. She said, "Oh, what do you got going on?" I said, "Well, I get to have a conversation with Wendy Widder. I'm excited about this." And I showed her these two books, and she was like, "Oh, interesting." So she's going to go and pick them up now. So I'm happy to keep doing that. I just wanted to read Daniel 12:3 and as a thank you, really, which is those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So, sincerely, thank you for making disciples and for taking a little bit of time to just kind of help me in that effort and grace and truth here, and everybody listening to Hungry for Wisdom. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dustin.